cameras rolling, metaphorically. Rowan leaned back in his chair at the long table near the entrance of the guild hall and took a sip from his tankard. His two colleagues, Marsh and Dunner, sat on either side of him, positioned for a clear view of the main floor. The guild hall of Bridger's Crossing was not a private place. It was the settlement's gathering point, a broad, stone-floored room with heavy timber beams and iron chandeliers where the trade guild conducted its business, settled its disputes, and hosted the weekly social gatherings that kept the border community functioning. On any given evening, 40 to 60 people passed through the hall. Merchants, tradespeople, farmers, laborers, human and orc alike. Tonight was a social evening. The tables were full, the bar was busy, and Rowan's carefully designed trap was set. He just sat down, Dunner muttered, nodding toward the center of the hall, smiling at the server. Clueless. Perfect, Rowan said. The moment she walks in and he realizes, boom, we've got him. Marsh shifted uncomfortably. You really think he'll bail on a deaf orc woman? That's harsh, even for exposing a fraud. That's exactly the point, Rowan replied, his voice dropping. St. Kellen can't keep up the act when it's actually inconvenient. We'll finally see who he really is. 3 guild members, one crowded hall, a blind date designed to prove that their guild's golden boy was a fraud. Kellen Ward had built his reputation on inclusion, on fairness, on caring, on being the man who mediated every human-orc dispute in the territory with patience and integrity. He had been appointed guild mediator 11 months ago, and in that time he had resolved more conflicts than his predecessor had in 5 years. The guild leadership was considering him for the head position, a promotion that would make him the youngest guildmaster in the territory's history. Rowan, Marsh, and Dunner had been in the guild for years. They had watched Kellen arrive, watched him charm the leadership, watched his reputation grow. And they had decided, with the specific certainty of men who needed someone else's success to be fake in order for their own mediocrity to be tolerable, that it was all an act. Nobody was that decent. Nobody cared that much. It had to be performance. So they had arranged a test. They had told Kellen that a friend of a friend, a woman named Thera, blonde, 30, a document clerk, was interested in meeting him. A blind date, low pressure. Just come to the guild hall on social night and see if there was a connection. What they had not told him was that Thera was orc and deaf. Think he'll bolt immediately? Dunner asked. Doesn't matter when, Rowan said. What matters is we catch it. The moment he realizes the look on his face, the excuse he makes, everyone in this hall will see it. The guild leadership will see who Kellen Ward really is when it actually costs him something. He took another sip. Everyone has a breaking point. Tonight, we find his. At 10 minutes before the 7th bell, Kellen Ward pushed through the heavy oak doors of the guild hall, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. 4 years since he had done anything remotely like this. 4 years since Marin had died and left him alone with a 3-year-old and a grief so large it had its own weather system. He had locked this part of himself away. Dating, romance, connection. All of it stored in a room he had decided not to enter again. But Wren had asked. His 7-year-old daughter, who noticed everything and forgave nothing, had looked at him 3 weeks ago with her enormous brown eyes and said, "Daddy, why don't you ever do anything fun anymore?" And he hadn't had a good answer. He spotted the table near the window, the one Rowan had described in his message. 2 chairs, a candle, a small arrangement of flowers that the hall's staff put on the social tables on event nights. Kellen sat down. He straightened his shirt. He caught his own reflection in the window glass. Clean jaw, tired eyes, the face of a man who had forgotten how to do this. If you can already feel what's coming, if you sense that this man is walking into something much bigger than a blind date, then you're in the right place. Subscribe, leave a like, tell us where you're watching from, because what happens next is going to change this hall forever. Thera arrived at 2 minutes past the 7th bell. She came through the main doors of the guild hall the way she entered every room, carefully, her eyes mapping the space before her body committed to it. She was orc, 30 years old, built with the strong, squared frame that orc women carried, wearing a dark green dress that was clean and pressed and clearly chosen with care. Her dark hair was pulled back, her face was composed, the practiced neutrality of a person who had learned to assess situations before fully entering them, because entering unprepared was a luxury that deaf people in a hearing world could not afford. The hall was loud, conversations, laughter, the clatter of tankards on wood. Thera could feel the vibrations through the stone floor, the bass hum of a full room, but the content was inaccessible. The words were shapes on lips, fragments caught and assembled, an endless translation exercise that required her full attention and still left gaps. She spotted the table by the window. The man sitting there, human, mid-30s, dark hair, plain clothing, was watching her approach. She read his face the way she read every face, quickly, thoroughly, searching for the flicker, the specific microsecond change in expression that happened when a person realized she was deaf. The tightening around the eyes, the shift in posture, the polite recalibration that preceded the excuse. She had seen it 17 times, 17 blind dates arranged by well-meaning friends, guild colleagues, a matchmaker in the Eastern Settlement who had tried twice before giving up. 17 times she had watched the flicker and known that the evening was over before it began. Some men left immediately. At least they were honest. Some stayed out of pity, which was worse. The performative kindness of a person who was enduring rather than engaging. Some spoke to her loudly and slowly as though deafness was a problem of volume rather than access. And some, the worst ones, were orc men. Because in orc culture, deafness carried a specific ancient stigma. A deaf orc could not hear battle commands, could not respond to the war horn, could not function in the precise, sound-dependent coordination of orc military tradition. Deaf orcs were called silent spirits, incomplete, disconnected from the rhythm of the clan. An orc woman who is a silent spirit was, by tradition, unmarriageable. Thera had been rejected by her own people before the humans even had a chance. She approached the table. The man, Kellen, the message had said, stood as she reached him. He extended his hand. "Thera?" he said. "I'm Kellen." She took his hand. She smiled, genuinely, because she decided years ago that she would give every date a genuine smile regardless of how it ended, because the alternative was arriving already defeated. "It's good to meet you," she said. Her voice was clear but slightly modulated, the voice of someone who could not monitor her own volume, who had spent a lifetime calibrating speech without the feedback loop that hearing people took for granted. She watched his face. She waited for the flicker. It did not come. Instead, Kellen looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not surprise, not pity, not the polite recalibration. Something else. Something that moved across his features too quickly to name, but that she recognized instinctively as recognition. He had noticed. She could see it. The way his eyes tracked her gaze to his lips, the way he registered the modulation in her voice, the small diagnostic details that told a perceptive person exactly what they were observing. He knew she was deaf. He had figured it out in the first 3 seconds, and instead of the flicker, he did something that Thera had never experienced in 17 blind dates. He raised his hands. His fingers moved with fluid, practiced grace, not the halting, uncertain movements of a person who had learned a few signs for the occasion, but the effortless, muscle memory fluency of a native speaker. Each sign was precise, weighted with decades of practice, and formed in a system that Thera recognized immediately. Not common sign language, not the simplified hand talk that border settlements used for basic communication between species. Orc war sign. The ancient military signal system of the orc clans, developed centuries ago for silent battlefield communication, adapted over generations for use by deaf orcs, and considered one of the most sacred linguistic traditions in orc culture, a language that hearing orcs respected but rarely learned, a language that humans almost never knew existed. Kellen's hand said, "It is a privilege to meet you. Thank you for coming tonight." The guild hall did not fall silent all at once. It happened in a wave. The tables nearest to Kellen and Thera going quiet first, as people noticed the movement of his hands, then the next ring of tables, then the next, until the entire hall was watching a human man sign orc war language to a deaf orc woman at a candlelit table. The people who had been laughing stopped laughing. The people who had been watching for the joke stopped waiting for the punchline. Because Orc war sign was not a casual skill. It was not a party trick. It was the language of Orc warriors, taught by veterans to their children, carried across generations as a form of cultural inheritance. A human who spoke it had not learned it from a book. A human who spoke it had learned it from an orc. Thera stared at his hands, then at his face, then at his hands again. Her own hands rose from the table, trembling slightly because nothing in 17 dates had prepared her for this. "You know war sign," she signed. "My mother was a deaf orc," Kellen signed back, settling into his chair with the ease of a man who had just switched into his native language. She was a border veteran. She lost her hearing in the battle at Thornridge when she was 26. She spent the rest of her life teaching war sign to anyone who would learn. She taught me before I could speak common tongue. His hands moved with a specific, distinctive fluency that came only from a lifetime of practice. The signs flowing into each other without pause, the grammar instinctive rather than translated, the rhythm natural. "This is my first language," he signed. "Honestly, I'm better at this than I am at talking." At the table near the entrance, Rowan's tankard was frozen halfway to his mouth. His face had lost all color. "What is he doing?" Marsh breathed, leaning forward so abruptly he nearly knocked over the candle. "Is he?" "Those are signs. Those are Orc war signs." "He knows war sign," Rowan said. His voice was hollow. "His mother was an orc. He actually knows war sign." Dunner looked at his colleagues. Then he looked at the hall, at the 60 people who had been watching for a joke and were instead watching something they had never seen. A human man and a deaf orc woman, communicating in the most sacred language of orc culture, at a table with a candle and flowers, on a blind date that had been designed as a humiliation. The hall was absolutely silent, and in that silence Kellen Ward pulled out Thera's chair, and she sat, and their hands began to move, and the conversation that followed was conducted entirely in a language that most of the room could not understand, but all of them could see, and it was beautiful. The conversation that unfolded over the next hour was unlike anything Thera had experienced in 3 years of catastrophic blind dates. Kellen did not sign slowly. He did not exaggerate his movements or simplify his grammar or treat her like she was fragile. He signed the way he would speak to any person he genuinely wanted to know, with fluency, with interest, with the natural rhythm of a man who had grown up inside this language and felt more himself in it than in spoken words. "So you're a document clerk," Kellen signed, leaning forward with real interest. "What kind of documents?" "Trade records, mostly." Thera signed back, her shoulders gradually loosening, the physical evidence of a guard being lowered. "Territorial contracts, shipping manifests, the occasional legal filing. It's not exciting work, but the documents don't care if I can hear them. That's a significant amount of trust. Trade records contain sensitive information. They trust me because I'm accurate. I've never made a transcription error in 6 years." She paused. "Also, I think they assume a deaf orc woman has nobody to tell secrets to." Kellen's expression shifted, a flash of recognition, the look of a man who had heard this particular kind of resignation before, not from a stranger, from someone closer. "What about you?" Thera signed. "What does a guild mediator actually do?" "I resolve disputes, human-orc conflicts mostly. Trade disagreements, territory boundaries, employment issues. People come to me when they've stopped being able to talk to each other, and I try to find the place where both sides can agree." "Do you like it?" "I do, though lately it's been complicated." "Guild politics." He made a sign that loosely translated to "people performing their own importance," and Thera laughed, a real unguarded sound that made several people at nearby tables look up and smile. She caught herself and stiffened slightly, the way deaf people often did when their own laughter surprised them. She could not hear how loud it was. She could never calibrate it. This was one of the small, constant vulnerabilities of deafness, the inability to monitor your own noise in a world that judged you by it. Kellen noticed the stiffening. He signed without pause, without calling attention to it. "Your laugh is fine. It made people smile. That's what laughs are supposed to do." Thera looked at him. "In 30 years, no one, hearing or deaf, human or orc, had ever addressed that specific insecurity with such casual precision. He had noticed the flinch, understood its cause, and dismissed the problem in a single sentence, without making her feel observed. This was not a man who had learned sensitivity from a training manual. This was a man who had grown up beside a deaf orc woman and absorbed the texture of that experience into his bones. A server approached to take their order. Kellen transitioned smoothly, speaking aloud to the server while simultaneously signing for Thera, translating the evening's options without her needing to ask. The dual communication was seamless, practiced, the product of a man who had spent his childhood translating between his mother's silent world and everyone else's loud one. Thera watched him do it and felt something crack open inside her, a door she had sealed shut after the 15th failed date, when an orc man from the eastern settlement had looked at her across a table and said, with the particular cruelty of someone who believed honesty excused unkindness, "I can't marry a silent spirit. My clan would never accept it." She had closed the door after that, decided that the world was not built for people like her, and that accepting this was not defeat, but realism. Now a human man was signing war language and ordering her dinner simultaneously, and the door was moving on its hinges whether she wanted it to or not. "Tell me about your daughter," Thera signed after their food arrived. Kellen's entire bearing changed. The mediator, controlled, precise, professional, dissolved into something looser, warmer, lit from inside. Her name is Ren. She's 7. She's obsessed with volcanoes, convinced the cat is plotting world domination, and she is the absolute center of my life. Most men don't mention their children this early. Ren isn't something I mention. She's the first thing anyone needs to know about me. If someone can't handle that, I come as a package. It's better to find out now. She's not a complication. She's the point. Thera set down her fork. She studied his face, the way it transformed when he signed about his daughter, the way the careful control of the mediator gave way to something completely unguarded. "Your wife?" she signed carefully. The question hung in the space between them, a space that was simultaneously public and private, because the hall was full of people who could see their hands moving but could not read what the hands said. Kellen's signing slowed. For the first time all evening his fluency faltered, not from lack of skill, but from the weight of what the words carried. "Marin," he signed. She was orc. She died 4 years ago. Ren was 3. It was a blood condition nobody knew about, not even her. One day Marin was planning Ren's birthday. 3 days later, he stopped, started again. I spent 4 years learning to be both parents, learning to braid hair, learning that the volcano documentary is always the right answer. I locked myself away from anything beyond Ren and me, told myself she needed stability, routine, just the two of us. He paused. "This is the first date I've been on since Marin died. My daughter asked me why I never did anything fun anymore, and I realized I didn't have an answer." Thera reached toward the table between them, not quite touching his hand, but close, a gesture of intent rather than contact. She knew about boundaries. She knew about the space that grief required. "I'm sorry," she signed. "That must still be hard." "It is. But Ren taught me something. You can't hide from life forever just because you're afraid of losing again. At some point, you choose to live, not just survive." "Is that what tonight is?" Thera signed a careful challenge in her expression. "Choosing to live?" Surprisingly, yes. Kellen signed, his expression easing. "You're much better company than my usual evening plans, which involve a 7-year-old and whichever volcano book she's currently reading for the 9th time. Thera laughed again. This time, she did not catch herself. This time, the laugh came out full and unmonitored, and she let it exist without apologizing for its volume. If you're watching a man sign war language to a deaf orc woman while an entire guild hall sits in stunned silence, if you understand that what's happening at that table is realer than anything the watchers planned, then you know this story. Subscribe, like, tell us in the comments, when was the last time someone spoke your language? The food was half finished when Kellen set down his fork and signed with careful deliberation. "Thera, I need to tell you something." Her hands stilled over her plate. The shift in his tone, visible in the precision of his signs, The deliberate spacing told her this was not casual. About halfway through dinner, I noticed them. He signed. He did not gesture toward Rowan's table. He did not need to. 3 men from the guild. They've been watching us since you arrived. They arranged this date. Thera's expression moved through stages. Confusion, then understanding, then something harder. The sharp, bright anger of a person who had been used before and recognized the shape of it. They set this up. She signed a deaf orc woman. To see if you'd run. Yes. Did you know before you came? No. But I knew the moment I saw the hall was full on a social night and 3 men I work with were sitting near the door with the specific body language of people waiting for something to go wrong. And you stayed. I stayed. Thera looked toward the entrance. She could see them. 3 men at a table, their postures rigid, their faces carrying the uncomfortable expression of people whose plan had failed in a way they could not process. She looked back at Kellen. Why didn't you leave or confront them? You could have ended this before it started. Kellen was quiet for a moment. His signs when they came were slower, weighted with something older than this evening. My mother, he signed. She was a deaf orc veteran. She lost her hearing at Thornridge. When she came to the settlement with my father, people laughed. A deaf orc woman married to a human. They thought it was bizarre. They stared. They whispered. Some of them arranged situations to embarrass her publicly, to see if my father would crack. He paused. He never cracked. He sat beside her in every room, signed beside her in every conversation, and looked at her instead of at the people watching. He taught me that when people are watching you to see if you'll fail, you don't look at them. You look at the person in front of you. His eyes met hers, so I looked at you, and I kept looking, and I forgot about them honestly, until just now. Thera held his gaze. 30 years of rejection, by humans who saw her species first, by orcs who saw her silence first, by a world that had no category for a deaf orc woman who was none of the things they expected, and this man had sat across from her and forgotten about the audience, because the conversation was more interesting than the trap. I've been on 17 blind dates, Thera signed. Each movement was loaded with exhausted history. 17 times I've watched men's faces change. Some leave. Some stay out of pity. Some speak loudly and slowly. And the orc men are worse, because they call me Silent Spirit and tell me their clan would never accept it. Her signs grew sharper. You are the first person, human or orc, who signed to me in war language, who knew my culture's most sacred communication form, who treated me like a person instead of a problem. And you did it in front of 60 people who were waiting for you to fail. She looked at the hall, then back at him. So what now? Was this real, or was I just part of their test? Kellen stood up. The movement was sudden enough that the nearest tables went quiet. Thera looked up at him, startled. Rowan's table went rigid. Kellen did not look at Rowan. He did not look at any of the 60 people in the hall. He looked at Thera. Then he turned toward the room and raised his hands. He signed. Slowly, deliberately. In orc war sign, the formal register, the version used for declarations, for oaths, for statements that were meant to be witnessed. I will see this woman again, not because of a test, not to prove anything, because she is worth knowing. Anyone with a problem can take it up with me. The hall was silent. 60 people, human and orc, watching a human man make a public declaration in the sacred language of orc warriors for a deaf orc woman who had been brought here as a joke. Not one person in the room said a word. Kellen sat back down. He picked up his fork. He looked at Thera, whose eyes were bright, whose hands were pressed flat on the table, as if she needed to hold herself in place. You didn't have to do that, she signed. I know, he signed back. My mother would have done the same thing, she said. If it's true, say it where people can see it. If you're ashamed of it, it isn't true enough. Thera looked at the man across the table, the human mediator who had signed war language, who had told her about his orc mother and his orc wife and his daughter, who had stood up in a crowded hall and declared his intention in the most public way possible. I'd like to see you again, too, she sighed. Saturday? Kellen signed. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Saturday arrived with the particular tension of a man introducing 2 parts of his life and hoping desperately that they would fit together. Kellen had cleaned the house twice. Wren had changed outfits 3 times, settling on her favorite dark red shirt with the embroidered stars that Marin had sewn on 2 months before she died. The cat had been bribed with extra food to stay off the furniture. Everything was as ready as it could be. "Daddy," Wren said, standing in the front hall with the coiled energy of a 7-year-old who had been asked to wait and was reaching the structural limits of her patience. "When is she coming?" "Any minute, Bug." "And she's deaf, like Grandma was?" "Like Grandma was." "And she's orc?" "Like Mama was?" Wren processed this with the focused intensity she applied to her volcano research. "So she's like Grandma and Mama put together." Kellen looked at his daughter. The observation was simple, delivered with the unfiltered directness of a child, and it landed in his chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Because Wren was right. She was exactly right, and he had not allowed himself to think about it in those terms until a 7-year-old said it out loud. "Something like that, Bug. Good," Wren said with absolute finality. "I'm ready." The knock came at the second bell of the afternoon. Wren was at the door before Kellen could move. A small, determined projectile in a red shirt. Her curly brown hair wild from the morning, her face set in the expression of a child who had been preparing for this moment since breakfast. She opened the door. Thera stood on the step. She was wearing a dark green jacket over a simple shirt, her dark hair down, carrying a small wrapped package. She looked, Kellen noticed from the hallway behind Wren, nervous. The controlled, contained nervousness of a woman who had been disappointed enough times to expect it and brave enough to show up anyway. Thera looked down at the small human girl in the doorway. Wren looked up at the orc woman on the step, and then Wren raised her hands. Her signs were not the clumsy approximate movements of a child who had learned a few gestures for the occasion. They were fluid, practiced, structured in the formal grammar of orc war sign with the specific distinctive style that Kellen recognized immediately, because he had seen it before, in his mother's hands. "Welcome to our house," Wren signed, her small fingers moving with careful precision. "My name is Wren. My dad told me about you. I heard you work with documents. I like documents too. I keep a record of every volcano I learn about." "Do you like volcanoes?" Thera did not move. She stood on the step, her arms at her sides, the wrapped package forgotten in her grip, and she looked at the 7-year-old human girl who was signing orc war language with the fluency of a native speaker. Not approximate, not simplified. Fluent, complete with the formal opening greeting that orc tradition required when welcoming a guest into a home for the first time. The tears came before Thera could stop them. They arrived without permission, without announcement. The sudden, overwhelming response of a woman who had spent 30 years in a world where no one spoke her language, who had given up expecting it, and who had just watched a child open a door and sign it as naturally as breathing. "You know war sign," Thera signed, her movements unsteady. "My grandma taught me," Wren signed back, her expression shifting to concern at the tears. "She was my daddy's mama. She was deaf like you. She taught me since I was little, before she died." Wren paused, then added with the earnest, unpracticed honesty of a child, "Did I make you sad? I didn't mean to. Was my signing wrong?" "No," Thera signed. She crouched, so she was at Wren's level, the package pressed against her chest, her eyes bright. "Your signing is beautiful. Nobody has ever. A child has never." She couldn't finish. The sign for what she was feeling did not exist in war language, because war language had been designed for battlefields and commands and the practical necessities of combat, not for the experience of being spoken to in your own language by a 7-year-old who had learned it from her dead grandmother. "Come in," Wren signed, reaching for Thera's hand with the easy, unselfconscious affection that children offer to people they have already decided to trust. "I want to show you my volcano books. I have 11. If this moment just undid you, if a 7-year-old signing war language to a deaf orc woman on a doorstep is the thing that breaks you open, then stay. Because what happens next between these two is going to reshape everything. Subscribe, like. Tell us, when was the last time someone spoke your language without being asked? What followed was 3 hours of unexpected, unscripted joy. Wren led Thera through the house by the hand, showing her every room with the proprietary pride of a child who considered her home the most interesting place in existence. The volcano books, all 11, were presented individually with signed commentary on each one's strengths and weaknesses. The rock collection was displayed on the bedroom floor. The drawings, dozens of them covering an entire wall, were explained in detail. Thera examined each one with genuine interest. She asked questions through sign, real questions, not polite ones, about the rock types, the eruption patterns, the differences between shield and composite volcanoes. Ren responded with the passionate, rapid-fire enthusiasm of a child whose favorite subject had just been taken seriously by a new adult. They moved to the kitchen. Ren insisted on making food, a simple meal she had learned from her father, assembled with the focused intensity of a scientist conducting an experiment. Thera helped, the two of them working side by side in a kitchen that had been built for Kellen and Marin, communicating entirely in war sign, their movements synchronized in the way that shared language synchronized people. Kellen stood in the doorway and watched. He watched his daughter sign with the fluency she had learned from his mother, the deaf orc veteran who had spent the last 3 years of her life teaching her granddaughter the language that the hearing world had never bothered to learn. He watched Thera respond with a naturalness he had not seen from her before, the guarded composure of their date replaced by an openness that children, with their refusal to perform, had a way of unlocking. And then something happened that Kellen did not expect. Ren signed something that made Thera stop. Her hands froze over the cutting board. She looked at the 7-year-old with an expression of pure surprise. "What did you just sign?" Thera asked. "The word for strong," Ren signed. "Grandma taught me." She said it was the old way of saying it. Thera stared at Ren's hands. Then she signed the same word, but differently, the modern form. 2 distinct signs for the same concept. The archaic version that Kellen's mother had preserved from her military service, and the contemporary version that Thera had learned in her own lifetime. "That's the old form," Thera signed, her expression shifting from surprise to something closer to awe. "I've seen it in documents, old military records from before the border treaties, but I've never seen anyone actually use it. It's been out of common sign for 50 years. Grandma used lots of old signs." Ren signed. She said the new ones were too short. She liked the long ones better because they were more polite. Thera looked at Kellen. Her signs were careful, weighted. "Your mother preserved archaic war sign, forms that are disappearing from orc culture, and she taught them to your daughter." Kellen nodded slowly. He had known his mother's signing was old-fashioned. She had been teased about it by younger orcs in the settlement, but he had not understood the linguistic significance of it. To him, it was simply how his mother talked. "Your daughter knows signs that most orc linguists have only read about," Thera signed. "She's carrying a piece of language that my own people are losing." She looked at Ren, who was cheerfully arranging food on a plate, unaware that she was a living archive of a dying dialect. "Can she teach me?" Thera signed. "Teach you?" "The archaic forms, the ones your mother taught her. I want to learn them." Kellen looked at his daughter, then at Thera. The deaf orc woman who had been rejected by human men and orc men, and the world in general, was asking to learn from a 7-year-old human girl who had been taught by a deaf orc grandmother. "Ren," Kellen signed. "Thera wants to know if you'd teach her some of Grandma's signs, the old ones." Ren's face did the thing it did when she was given information she considered spectacular. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened, and her entire body vibrated with the effort of containing her excitement. "Yes," she signed, with such force that the cat, who had been sleeping on the counter, startled awake and fell off. For the next hour, the roles reversed entirely. Ren sat on the kitchen counter, the position of authority in her world, and signed archaic war forms, while Thera stood beside her practicing each one, her adult hands learning movements that a child's hands already knew. Kellen watched them, the orc woman and the human girl, trading language back and forth across a kitchen counter, laughing when signs went wrong, celebrating when they went right. 2 people separated by 23 years and 2 species, and an ocean of experience connected by a dead woman's insistence on keeping the old words alive. He thought about his mother, about the fierce, stubborn veteran who had refused to let anyone make her feel less because she could not hear, who had taught her son her language before he could speak his own, who had spent her final years teaching her granddaughter the same language, preserving it in a 7-year-old's muscle memory, the way libraries preserved books. His mother had been right about everything, and the proof was standing in his kitchen, learning from his daughter. Monday morning arrived with the weight of unfinished business. Kellen walked into the guild hall to find Rowan, Marsh, and Dunner standing near the center of the main floor, not at their usual table by the entrance, in the center, where everyone could see them. The hall was occupied, the morning work session, perhaps 30 people conducting business at various tables, the same hall where the blind date had taken place 4 days earlier, the same audience, or enough of it that the continuity was clear. Rowan stepped forward when he saw Kellen. His face carried the specific expression of a man who had decided to do something difficult and was determined to finish it before his courage failed. "Kellen," Rowan said. His voice carried across the hall. Several people looked up. "We need to say something," Rowan continued. "And we need to say it here, in the same room, in front of the same people." Kellen stopped. He looked at the 3 men. He looked at the hall. He understood immediately what was happening. The symmetry of it, the deliberate choice to confess in the same space where the crime had been committed. "Go ahead," Kellen said. Rowan drew a breath. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough for the hall to hear, not shouting, but projecting. The voice of a man who had decided that if the humiliation was going to be public, so was the accountability. 4 days ago, we arranged a blind date for Kellen. We told him we were setting him up with a woman named Thera. What we didn't tell him was that Thera is deaf and orc. We did this deliberately. We wanted to see him fail. We wanted to watch him reject a deaf orc woman so we could prove to the guild leadership that his reputation for inclusion was fake. The hall had gone quiet. 30 people, frozen mid-conversation, listening. "Jack," we scratched off his heel. "Jack," seeming back to the sound. "Making no sound, forever. How'd affect it, whatsoever. That's my fake. Once in year, we go farther way. Today, I wanted to see him forever way." "We were wrong," Rowan said, "about everything. We watched him sign war language to a woman we had brought here as a punchline. We watched him treat her with respect and genuine connection while we sat in a corner waiting for him to be cruel. And we realized that the only people in this hall who failed a test that night were us." Marsh spoke next, his voice rougher, his eyes unable to meet Kellen's directly. "What we did was cruel, not just to Kellen, to Thera. We used a person's deafness and her species as a weapon. There is no version of that which is acceptable, and we are not going to pretend there is." Dunner was last. "We've already spoken to the guild elders. We reported what we did and accepted their judgment. But we wanted to say it here, in the same room, in front of the people who were present. Because if the humiliation was public, the apology should be too." The hall was silent. 30 people processing the admission. Some looked at Kellen. Some looked at their own hands. Kellen was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but layered with something that was not anger. It was older than anger. It was recognition. "You know what the saddest part is," he said. "If you had just talked to me, gotten to know me, none of this would have been necessary." He looked at each of them. "I am not perfect. I lose my temper, I make mistakes, I burn dinner 4 nights a week, and I still cannot figure out how to make my daughter's hair look decent for the guild school portrait. But I'm not performing. I don't have the energy for that. I'm just trying to do good work and be a decent person." He paused. "My mother was a deaf orc veteran. People treated her exactly the way you treated Thera, as a test, a spectacle, a way to measure someone else's character. My father spent 20 years standing beside her in rooms full of people who were waiting for him to fail. I learned from him. I'm not doing anything extraordinary. I'm doing what he taught me." He looked at Rowan. "I appreciate you saying it here. It doesn't fix it, but it's a start." He turned and walked toward his desk. Behind him, 3 men stood in the center of a guild hall, bearing the weight of their choices in front of the community they had tried to manipulate. The guild leadership vote came through 2 days later. Kellen Ward, guildmaster, the youngest in the territory's history. approved unanimously. The months that followed moved with the strange, suspended quality of a life being rebuilt, not from scratch, but from pieces that had been waiting to be assembled. Kellen settled into the guildmaster position with the same controlled precision he applied to everything. He ran meetings. He resolved disputes. He navigated the endless, intricate politics of a border territory where human and orc interests collided daily, and someone had to stand in the middle and find the ground where both sides could agree. But the ground had shifted, and everyone in the guild hall knew why. Thera was in the hall now, not as a visitor, not as a curiosity, not as the deaf orc woman from the blind date story that had become local legend within a week of it happening. She was there because Kellen had offered her a position, guild clerk, responsible for the official documentation of every meeting, every dispute resolution, every trade agreement that passed through the hall. It was a public role, visible, central. The guild clerk sat at the front table during sessions, recording decisions in real time, maintaining the archive that constituted the territory's institutional memory. It was a position that required precision, discretion, and the ability to work in a room full of people who were constantly talking. Thera was, by every conventional measure, the wrong candidate. She could not hear the proceedings, she could not take spoken dictation, she could not participate in the verbal back and forth that characterized guild debates. She was also, by every practical measure, the best clerk the guild had ever had. She read lips with the focused precision of a person who had spent 30 years decoding speech without sound. She cross-referenced statements in real time, catching contradictions that hearing clerks missed because they were processing content sequentially while she was processing it visually, watching mouths, watching faces, watching the physical language that accompanied speech and that often told a different story than the words themselves. Her transcriptions were flawless, not approximately accurate. Flawless. 6 years of document work had trained her to record information with zero error tolerance, and she applied that standard to the guild proceedings with a rigor that made the previous clerk's work look careless by comparison. Within 2 months, the guild members had stopped noticing that she was deaf. They had stopped noticing that she was orc. What they noticed was that the records were better. The archive was organized, and the woman sitting at the front table caught things that everyone else missed. "She doesn't hear what we say," one of the elder guild members observed during a session break. "She sees what we mean. I'm not sure which is more useful." Thera's presence in the guild hall changed the room in ways that no one had planned and that everyone noticed. The members signed more, not all of them, not fluently, not in war sign, but the basic courtesy signs that border settlements used for cross-species communication. Greetings, acknowledgments, the small gestural vocabulary that said, "I see you. I know you're here. I'm trying." Rowan was the first of the 3 conspirators to learn a real war sign. He spent 2 weeks practicing a single gesture, the orc sign for respect, a specific hand position that orc warriors used when acknowledging a superior or an equal. He performed it in the guild hall one morning, standing by the door as Thera passed on her way to the clerk's table. It was clumsy. His fingers were in the wrong position and his wrist angle was off by several degrees. Any orc veteran would have corrected him immediately. Thera stopped. She looked at his hands, she looked at his face, then she adjusted his fingers, gently, efficiently, the way a teacher corrected a student, and continued to her desk. Rowan stood by the door for a long moment after she passed. His expression was difficult to read, but it was not the expression of a man who was performing contrition. It was the expression of a man who was learning. The first anniversary approached with a question that Kellen had been carrying for months. He had discussed it with Ren, because Ren was a participant in every major decision, and because her opinion mattered more than anyone else's, and because she was 7 years old and had a clarity about emotional matters that Kellen envied. "Do you want Thera to be part of our family?" he had asked her one evening, sitting on the edge of her bed while the cat occupied the pillow. Ren had looked at him with the expression of a child who was being asked a question whose answer was so obvious that the asking itself was slightly insulting. "She already is part of our family, Daddy. She's here every day. She does the shadow stories with me. She knows all my volcano facts. She fixed the shelf in my room. She taught me 4 new signs last week, including the one for eruption, that I didn't know." She paused, then added with devastating directness, The question isn't whether she's part of our family. The question is when you're going to tell her. Kellen looked at his daughter, 7 years old, Marin's eyes, his mother's stubbornness. You're right, Bug. I know. He chose the Guildhall, not because it was convenient, or because it was practical, or because any wedding advisor in the territory would have recommended it. He chose it because it was the place where the story began, the place where 3 men had set a trap and the trap had caught something none of them expected, the place where Kellen had raised his hands and signed war language to a stranger, the place where the hall had gone silent and stayed silent and understood, collectively, that what it was witnessing was not a joke, but the beginning of something real. He wanted the same room, the same witnesses, the same table by the window where the candle and the flowers had been. Not because the symmetry mattered, because the honesty did. It was a social evening. The hall was full, 60 people, the same capacity as the night of the blind date. Kellen had not announced anything. He had simply reserved their table and asked Wren to wear her red shirt with the stars. Thera arrived at the 7th bell. She walked to the table and sat down, the way she had a dozen times in the past year. Their table, their place, the corner of the Guildhall that had become theirs by repetition and right. Kellen sat across from her. Wren sat between them. The cat was at home, unaware that history was being made without him. Halfway through the meal, Wren looked at Kellen. He nodded. The 7-year-old set down her fork, straightened in her chair, and turned to Thera with the solemn focus of a child who had been rehearsing this moment for a week. Her hands moved in war sign, slowly, precisely. Each sign formed with the careful, reverent attention of a girl who understood that these signs were her grandmother's language, her mother's culture, and the bridge between every world she belonged to. Thera, Wren signed. Can I ask you something important? Thera's brow furrowed with curiosity. Of course. Little one, Wren took a breath. Then she signed, Would you like to be part of our family? Officially, forever. Thera's hands froze mid-air. Her eyes moved from Wren to Kellen, who had risen from his chair and moved to stand beside the table. He was standing, not kneeling. His mother had told him years ago that Orc tradition did not require a person to lower themselves to ask for commitment. You stand for the things you mean, she had said. Kneeling is for apologies. Commitment is done on your feet. Kellen raised his hands. The entire hall was watching. 60 people, human and orc, at their tables, their conversations suspended, their attention drawn to the man standing beside the candlelit table where a deaf orc woman and a 7-year-old human girl were waiting. Kellen signed, slowly, in the formal register of Orc War Sign, the same register he had used a year ago when he stood in this room and declared his intention. Every sign precise, every movement deliberate. No sound, no spoken words, no translation. The proposal existed entirely in movement, in the language of a dead orc veteran, passed to her son, practiced in 100 quiet conversations, and now used for its highest purpose. Thera, you walked into this hall a year ago, and I was supposed to be tested by your presence. Instead, I was changed by it. You taught me that courage is showing up when every experience tells you not to. You taught my daughter signs her grandmother never had time to finish teaching. You made this hall, this room where they tried to humiliate us, into the place where I found the person I want to spend my life beside. His hands moved with a steadiness that contradicted the emotion visible on his face. I am not asking you to complete us. We were not incomplete, but I am asking you to choose us. Every day. The way you have been choosing us for a year, the way you chose to walk through that door on the night they told you to, even though 17 doors before had led to nothing. He reached into his coat, a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, silver, with a small green stone. He held it toward her open, waiting. Will you marry us? Thera looked at the ring, at Kellen, at Wren, whose small face was radiating so much hope it was almost physically bright. At the hall, the 60 people watching, unable to understand the signs, seeing only a man standing and a woman sitting, and a child between them and a ring in a box, and the specific, unmistakable shape of a question being asked. But You ever rode away from the city of the Riverrand, from Peter's president of the Aranda priest who is best known as you would be. They could not hear the proposal. They could not read the signs, but they could see Thera's face. The way the guard dropped, the way the protective composure she had maintained for 30 years dissolved, the way her eyes filled with something that was not grief or resignation or the exhausted acceptance of disappointment, but its exact luminous opposite. Her hands rose from the table. Yes, she signed. Yes, yes. The single sign repeated 3 times, each repetition larger, more emphatic. Her body leaning into it was visible to everyone in the hall, even if the word itself was not. The hall erupted, not in the organized, polite applause of a formal event, in the raw, unstructured sound of 60 people responding to something they had witnessed with their eyes rather than their ears. Cheering, clapping, the sound of tankards being struck against tables in the border tradition that meant approval. Wren launched herself at both of them, creating a tangle of arms and laughter and joy. Kellen slipped the ring onto Thera's finger. She looked at it, the green stone against her green skin, the simple silver band on a hand that had spent 30 years signing into rooms that did not answer. This room had answered, if a silent proposal just made you cry, if you understood that the most powerful thing in this story was spoken without a single word, then you know why stories like this need to exist. Subscribe, like, tell us in the comments, what's the most important thing anyone ever said to you without speaking? The wedding was held 3 weeks later in the Guild Hall, at the same table, with the same candle. Wren wore a new red dress, one Thera had helped her choose, with embroidered stars that matched the ones Marin had sewn years ago. Kellen wore the dark formal clothing he wore for guild sessions. Thera wore green, a simple, elegant dress that she had chosen herself, without a tailor, without adjustment, without anyone telling her what to hide. The ceremony was conducted in 2 languages. The guild elder spoke the official vows aloud, the standard border marriage text, delivered in common tongue for the hall to hear. Kellen repeated them, his voice carrying across the room. And then, simultaneously, the vows were signed. Wren stood between her father and Thera, facing the hall. She was the translator, the 7-year-old girl who had learned war sign from her dead orc grandmother, who had taught archaic forms to a deaf orc linguist, who had asked, "Would you like to be part of our family, with hands that carried 3 generations of language?" That girl now stood at a wedding and translated her father's spoken words into the signs that her stepmother could see. Every vow that Kellen spoke aloud, Wren signed in war language. Her small hands moved with a fluency that made the orc members of the audience go still, because the signs were not just accurate, they were beautiful. They carried the cadence and the weight of a tradition that most hearing orcs had never bothered to learn, performed by a human child with the natural grace of someone who had grown up inside the language. Thera watched Wren's hands. She watched her own vows being interpreted by a child who loved her in a language that her people had told her was not meant for someone like her. And the tears that came were not the tears of a woman who had been disappointed 17 times and was hoping this one would be different. They were the tears of a woman who had stopped hoping and had been proven wrong. When the vows were complete, Kellen and Thera faced each other. He signed. The final exchange was private. 2 people speaking a language that the room could see but not read, sharing words that belonged only to them. The hall wept, not silently. 30 years of border stoicism cracked open in that room, and the sound that emerged was the raw, unashamed sound of 60 people watching a family being made from pieces that should not have fit together and that fit perfectly. That evening, after the guests had gone and the hall had been cleared and the candle on their table had burned to a stub, the 3 of them went home. Wren changed into her sleeping clothes. The cat reclaimed the pillow. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. The creaking, the wind, the familiar architecture of a home that had been built for 2 people, expanded for 3, and was now, officially, full. They sat together on the floor of the front room. Not on furniture, on the floor. Because Wren had decided that the floor was where shadow stories happened, and shadow stories were what she wanted. Kellen lit a candle and placed it behind them. The flame threw their shadows onto the far wall, 3 shapes, overlapping, distinct. Wren raised her hands. On the wall, a shadow volcano erupted. Her fingers spread wide, her wrists twisting to create the flowing movement of lava. Thera raised her hands. On the wall, the lava became a river, a flowing shape that wound between shadow mountains, carrying tiny shadow debris. Kellen raised his hands. On the wall, shadow people ran from the eruption, tiny and frantic, stumbling over each other. Wren giggled. The sound was unmonitored and perfect. They told the story together, hands moving, shadows dancing, no words spoken. A volcanic eruption, a river of lava, people running. Then, Wren's addition, a small shadow figure standing still while everyone else ran, looking up at the volcano with curiosity instead of fear. "That's me," Wren signed, pointing at the still figure. "I would study the eruption. I wouldn't run." "That's definitely you," Kellen signed back. "What would you do?" Wren asked Thera. Thera considered the question with the serious attention she gave to everything Wren asked. Then she raised her hands and created a shadow figure that walked toward the volcano, not running away, not standing still, but walking forward, toward the thing that was dangerous, toward the thing that everyone else was fleeing. "I would go closer," Thera signed. "I've spent my whole life running from things. I'm done running." Wren looked at the shadow figure walking toward the volcano. Then she moved her own shadow figure to walk beside it. "I'll go with you," she signed. Kellen added his shadow figure. 3 shapes on the wall, walking toward the eruption together. The candle flickered. The shadows danced. The house was quiet except for the sounds it always made, the creaking and the wind and the breathing of 3 people who had found each other against every odd, and who were on this ordinary evening, in this ordinary room, doing the ordinary, extraordinary thing of being a family. Later that night, after Wren was asleep with her face pressed against the cat's fur, and her hand still curled in the loose shape of the last sign she had made before sleep took her, Kellen stood in her doorway. He watched her breathe. He watched her hands, the small, certain hands that carried his mother's language and his daughter's future, and the bridge between every world he had ever belonged to. He thought about a guild hall 1 year ago, about 3 men who had set a trap, about a door opening and a woman walking through it, about the moment he had raised his hands and signed the first words he ever said to the person who would become his wife. He thought about what Wren had said months ago, with the devastating directness of a child who saw things that adults obscured. "She's already part of our family, Daddy. The question is when you're going to tell her." He thought about his mother, the fierce, deaf orc veteran who had refused to be diminished by a hearing world, who had taught her son a language, who had taught her granddaughter the same language, who had died knowing that the words she carried would not die with her. And he thought about Thera, about the woman who had been rejected 17 times and had walked through an 18th door anyway, who had been called silent spirit by her own people and had chosen to keep speaking, who had sat in a guild hall full of people who were waiting for a joke and had instead witnessed the beginning of everything. They had been a family from the moment he raised his hands, from the moment his fingers formed the shapes his mother had taught him, and the deaf orc woman across the table recognized them, and the hall went silent. And the silence, for once, was not empty. It was the fullest sound in the room. Everything else was paperwork.